Hi guys, Josh West over here. Welcome to The Real Stories. Today I'm meeting with an incredible woman called Ashley, who's got a really powerful and inspiring story. Her story involves addiction, mental health, neurodivergence, and it leads up to the inspiring story of Ashley starting her own podcast to help other people, which I find absolutely amazing. So I'm meeting Ashley soon. I hope you enjoy the episode.
Hi, my name's Ashley, and I went from being an addict to a podcaster. This is my story. As a mental health practitioner and addictions counsellor, I really understand why it is that I got to where I was. And I think one of the things that I thought going into my training was that addiction is the individual's fault. And I really started to realise that actually addiction is just a symptom of something else that's went on. So when I developed my addiction, I had this unique insight where I knew all the information behind why I was experiencing what I was. And it was really helpful because I think one of the things that we struggle with is shame when it comes to addiction. But when I started looking at why I am the way I am, I started to realise that I could trace it right back to my childhood. So as a child, my parents were divorced at the age of 2, which I know might not sound like much, but for that child, having their parents no longer living together is actually a huge thing, and it affects what we call attachment style. So one thing I realised for me is that my parents split up when I was 2, which might not sound like much. However, when we look at it from a psychological perspective, this really impacts our what's called attachment style. So for me, I learned that relationships aren't safe. I didn't have a relationship which was healthy modelled to me, which then translated in my relationships when I started growing up. And I think this is where the issue really began for me. So from my very first partner, what I experienced was sexual abuse. And this continued in a stream of really unhealthy relationships where there was quite a lot of sexual abuse and different types of abuse. So how this translated for me was that I started experiencing a string of really unhealthy relationships, which massively took its toll on my self-confidence. And I was just in this cycle of experiencing abuse with partner after partner. So in my 20s, I was experiencing a lot of really quite unhealthy relationships. And alongside that, I started to develop what my psychiatrist called an addiction to mind-altering substances. So I literally spent my 20s just being on some kind of drug or alcohol every day. So as an addictions counsellor, I know that I was self-medicating this trauma. But then when I turned 32, so I had my son, and I had got sober, but I was still really struggling to be sober. And I ended up relapsing a few times, and I thought I actually need to get some actual support here. So I spoke to a psychiatrist and found out that I had ADHD. So that was my first diagnosis, and my psychiatrist said to me that essentially what had been happening was that I was trying to self-medicate not only my trauma, but also this mental health disorder. And they started to medicate us, which was really helpful because I was no longer medicating myself, which isn't ideal when you're a parent. And I think that point for me was a huge change. And I think the being diagnosed was a huge turning point for me as a mother, because I started to let go of the shame that I'd been carrying around being an addict and feeling like I was doing something wrong, and actually realised that this isn't an addiction, this isn't me being a bad person or being a bad mother, but actually I'm trying to self-medicate an undiagnosed disorder.
So thank you, nice to meet you. Thank you for coming to see me today.
Nice to meet you, thank you.
So, to start your story.
Just realised I'm neurodivergent mirroring you.
So yeah,
That is a symptom right there.
no worries, we can do that. It's it's symmetrical.
It was symmetrical.
We like that.
But now I feel like I've got to change.
Make him,
Right, okay.
So yeah, your story in your early years, that's where it all sort of started, wasn't it?
Yeah. And I think that is, for a lot of people, it is where it starts. I think just often we just look at the addiction, we don't look at why do I have that addiction.
What sort of age were you when you started getting addicted?
So I started, well, I'm vaping. I started smoking at the age of 12, and I started drinking not that much longer, about 13, 14, and then it escalated. I tried my first drug when I was about 14, which was weed, and then by 17 I was taking cocaine, and then I moved to Ibiza, which was great, but that's where I started taking more recreational drugs. But I didn't consider myself having an addiction, actually, but my psychiatrist said it was an addiction of mind-altering substances, because actually in my 20s I don't think there was a day where I was sober.
Wow.
Yeah, it was something different each time.
Was it so you were always just looking for something to sort of fill a gap that you, and that gap, I guess, was struggling mentally with certain things, right?
It was actually, so this is where my counselling side's coming out. So it was actually, when you've got ADHD, you've got an issue with your dopamine production. So I just don't produce the right amount of dopamine. So actually what I was doing was I was seeking something which was given as that dopamine. So that was the one side of it. But then I was also medicating all the trauma that I had, that I was just repeatedly experiencing. And so there was these two things that I was medicating, and I was not aware of any of them.
It must be. I mean, look, 12, 13 years of age is a really young age, even to start smoking or drinking. I think there's going to be a lot of young people out there, or parents thinking maybe, is my kid drinking, or is my kid doing that? Like, where was your protection at that age?
Well, actually, so because I've got a background, so I've got a master's in addiction, and actually there's something called the normalization theory, where what the research shows is actually that a lot of children and young people do use drugs and alcohol as a rite of passage. And certainly with my generation, drugs are becoming more and more regular. And I actually did my first dissertation on prevention of addiction, because one of the things that I realised is that we can't say don't take drugs. A lot of children and young people are going to be taking them. It's more about, like you say, protecting them within that. And if you've got trauma that's unresolved, or you've got these undiagnosed mental health disorders, just using drugs doesn't mean you're going to be addicted. But if you have these two things, these two factors, then you're more susceptible to addiction. So actually, if I had been diagnosed as a young age, then that might have prevented us from developing that addiction. If I had have had the right counselling and support around us, then again, that might have prevented that addiction. So I think it's actually the lack of support and awareness that was really detrimental to me.
So I remember you touched base on people judging people for addiction, and I've probably done that by accident before, because it's like I think a lot of people can be guilty for that, because you don't understand why they're doing it, or why they're, as you nailed it, no one chooses, and I've always taught this actually, no one chooses to wake up and go, I want to take this and be addicted to this.
Yeah.
It's not a fun life, right?
No, it's not. And it is, though. It is in the beginning. And this is something that I think we need to be careful about, there's a reason why you end up in this state of addiction, is because you're enjoying it. But there's a point where it switches over and you think, actually, this is starting to impact my life in a negative way, so I need to stop. But by that point, you're already too deep, yeah.
Too addicted.
Yeah, you're addicted, and you realise you have an addiction, and then all of a sudden you think, oh, how am I going to get out of it?
And so when you were in your 20s and you were, let's say, Ibiza, or out with your friends, going out and enjoying drugs in a recreational way, what was in your mind? Were you always like, I'm a bit worried, I'm subconsciously worried that I'm addicted to this lifestyle? Or did you just sort of ride it out and let it just be?
So again, this is like me going into my into my therapeutic tool bag, but your brain isn't developed. So like your frontal lobe isn't developed until the age of 25. So actually, we've got this situation where a lot of young people are trying drugs and alcohol, but they're also not able to comprehend what's going on. We don't have that decision making part of our brain fully developed at this point. So you're actually just kind of going through the motions. It's a bit like a dog, you're just doing and being. So at the time, I was just enjoying myself. I had the best time. And when I look back on my early years, even though it was very infused with alcohol and drugs, it was some of the best times of my life. But it was the point where I started getting older and all my friends stopped doing that. They started having families, careers, children. And then me and a handful of people were still using drugs. And it's interesting because actually the people who I know who've got addiction all have now been diagnosed with divergence. So the two go hand in hand.
Yeah. I know addiction and ADHD does go hand in hand. I've been told that myself. And I think a lot of, like, it's drugs, gambling, it can be sex, it could be, you know, porn, it could be like people that are neurodivergent, would you say, are, another professional, more likely to be addicted?
100%. I mean, it's a stats show that you're 50% more likely to be addicted if you've got ADHD.
That's high.
That is high. And that's drugs and alcohol. There's so many different addictions, and I still have some scrolling on my phone, for instance.
Yeah, I'm bad for that.
Yeah. Gaming, so that's another big one where you're addicted to getting that. Because it's all to do with dopamine, so anything that you get excessive dopamine from.
You a hardcore gamer, are you?
No, I just know.
I was going to see you dropping in on Fortnite, maybe.
And no, that is not me.
I don't play that, by the way.
I would say that's not my, unfortunately, that's not my addiction, but actually I think that would be an unfortunate addiction. But yeah, you're just more likely to be addicted. So the 50% more likely is actually drugs and alcohol. But if you look at the likelihood of being addicted and you spread that out to things which are more socially acceptable, I think you'll find a high majority of people with ADHD. And I think with bipolar, you're more likely to experience addiction in different parts of it. So when you're low mood, you might lean into alcohol or drugs to make you feel better. But then when you have manic episodes or hypomania, you're more likely to take risks, so you might go down that route.
Yeah.
But with autism, I mean, it's so socially awkward that actually what you find is a lot of people will drink alcohol so they can blend in with friends and not experience that social anxiety, and again, that can develop into a dependency.
It's almost like putting a plaster on, isn't it? Like a temporary plaster, and it's going to fall off at some point. You have to do it again.
Yeah, and even if you look at ADHD meds, they are essentially speed or methamphetamine. So you've just been prescribed a legal drug.
I don't need speed for my ADHD. I need to slow down. I need to slow down.
This is what it does. It actually does slow you. It has an opposite effect. And when I sat down with a psychiatrist, one of the things that was spoke about was when I used to take cocaine in little amounts, or when I did take speed, I just felt like, why is it affecting me so differently? My brain would just calm down. I'd feel more zen. Everybody else is going a million miles an hour. And I remember once I said, I don't want to have speed, I'm not having it. I'll be up all night, and I actually fell asleep sitting up in a chair. So it has the opposite effect, which again, I think shows why people are so drawn to self-medicating. One of the things that research talks about in terms of addiction is actually a huge disproportionate amount of women who are in services are actually mothers. And it's really interesting to me because you would think that as a mother, you've got the most to lose in terms of social services. Hello. So it's interesting to me because you'd think as a mother, one of the most harrowing times to go into a service is when you know that social services are going to be involved. But one of the things that I realised as a mum is that I actually really need to get sober, not just for me, but for my son. And I had tried to be sober a few times and successfully done it, but I just kept slipping up, and I just couldn't. It took that one bad day or that one stressful day, and for the first time I was experiencing huge stress that I couldn't just take myself away from or self-medicate like I had in the past. So there was a point where I thought I really do need to get support here, because I keep trying to get sober doing it, but it's my son now who who needs his mum. So I remember being absolutely terrified and decided to reach out to my loved ones for support. And the issue with addiction is there's so much stigma around it that people automatically just don't know how to deal with that. And I was experiencing so much shame as an addict, but also as a mother. And my biggest fear was that that was going to be mirrored back to us. And unfortunately, when I did reach out to people, it was, and I experienced so much shame. I went from being told that my son was thriving, I was doing amazing. And then as soon as this bit of information was now available, I went to being a disgrace of a mum and being a really bad mum. And it was just so much to deal with. I, yeah, it was really difficult. I think probably one of the most difficult times in my life, because I was trying to get sober, but at the same time, I just felt like my whole world had imploded. I felt so ashamed. I felt like everyone was disappointed, and I was still having to just pull myself up out of the depths of hell. And I don't, I don't think anybody who hasn't been an addict can realize how difficult it is to stop. My God, it was one of the hardest things I've ever done. But to do that whilst also feeling like everybody's judging us, because it's not that their fault. I don't blame anybody who did shame us. And a lot of people had also dealt with really difficult traumatic situations around addiction themselves. So family members that they'd lost, and just the impacts of addiction. But they didn't know how to support us. And I think we have this idea of a society that if somebody has an addiction, they're a bad person. If you have a parent who has an addiction, they're a bad mom. But actually what research shows is that a lot of parents who are struggling with addiction are the ones who go to the services despite knowing the impacts of that. So I don't think it's being a bad parent. It's actually being a desperate parent who needs the support. And actually, as a society, we don't know how to support these people. We hear addict, we think bad person. We don't think, why is that person struggling with the addiction in the first place? My PhD on the barriers that women face entering drug addiction services, one of the key things that I really resonated with, that I found, was that actually a lot of the women who were in services are mothers. And I remember when I looked at these statistics, I thought, I really get that. But one of the interesting things is that mothers have got the most to lose going into these services. As soon as you are open about having an addiction, you are leaving yourself open for social services to be involved, which, by the way, I had involved myself because I felt like it was the right thing to do with my son. But as a mother, you've got that fear, is my child's going to be taken away from us, which I do want to say is not true. That was such a big fear and barrier for me, but they do actually support you. But I remember I had managed to get sober when I got pregnant, and being a mother with undiagnosed neurodivergence is actually so difficult. And I kept relapsing. So I had relapsed twice once I had my son in his first 8 months. And the level of shame that I experienced, because it wasn't just the shame of being an addict, which is huge, but it was also the shame of I'm a really bad mother. So it got to the point when I had relapsed for the second time, and I thought, I really need to involve people. I need some support. So I faced my fears for my son, and I reached out to those closest to us and explained what was going on. And it was honestly one of the most difficult things I've ever done. But what was really hard about it was my worst fear was that I was going to experience the shame that I felt reflected back to us, which is exactly what happened. I went from being a great mum who just weeks before they were saying that my son was thriving to all of a sudden them getting this bit of information that I was an addict to now I'm a disgrace of a mum. My son isn't getting looked after properly, and it was just so incredibly painful. I don't blame them, but it just highlights how much, as a society, we don't understand addiction, and we think that it's the person is doing something bad instead of knowing how to support them. And if you haven't been through addiction and recovery, I don't think you can even grasp how difficult it is to stop. We use this language of it's a choice. Yes, it is a choice, but if it was that easy of a choice, you would do it. Nobody enjoys being an addict, certainly not as a parent. So for me, yes, it was a choice, but it was the most difficult choice I've ever made in my entire life. And I had to drag myself out of the depths of hell, trying to recover, which every day was difficult, but also getting shamed alongside it, having to be brave and involve social services, whilst also trying to parent, and at this point, parent as a neurodivergent mum when I was unaware that that's what my addiction was doing. It was medicating that. So it was a really difficult time in my life. And at the time, I felt like the worst person in the world, the worst mother. But looking back, I am so incredibly proud of myself for that time. I'm getting a little bit emotional speaking about it because I really did just have to pull this grit and determination that I honestly didn't think I had to pull myself out of it for my son.
Having your parents split up obviously is difficult for anyone.
Yeah.
How did that affect you, and how did that lead to your unhealthy relationships?
Yes, I don't actually remember them splitting up. And I think this is one of the things with attachment style is it's 0 to 3, so we don't realise it's happening. But actually, what I learned is I just wasn't modelled a healthy relationship. So then I wasn't able to recognise unhealthy relationships.
Yeah, okay, so you couldn't sort of pinpoint that and work out what's right, wrong, normal, not normal. And I know we used the word, I don't like the word normal, but, I guess you didn't realise that you didn't have a ballpark of how a relationship is.
Yeah. And I think this is why it's so important to get professional help, because it actually, me learning about attachment style through being a counsellor gave me that insight. And I think if I hadn't learned that, I would probably still be in the same situation.
Thank you for answering that, because I just definitely asked that question in the worst way possible. You picked up on what I was getting at, though. I said, thank you very much.
You were putting down.
Appreciate you.
So an absolute game changer for me as a mother and just as a person in general was when I got my diagnosis for ADHD. Up until that point, I honestly just felt like a flawed human being. And this was the whole way through my life. As a child, I was always in trouble. Used to try so hard, but I was on head of year report because I just disrupted the class so much. And in my head, I was just being me. So when I got my diagnosis, it was almost like this sense of relief. I remember crying, and I honestly think that most people with neurodivergence will experience this feeling where all of a sudden you think, I'm not a bad person, I've just got a disorder, and it's almost like that shame just drops off you. So I remember I had started to realise that actually I think I've got ADHD or potentially autism. And it was just as I was coming off my addiction. So I decided to book a private psychiatrist to go through the diagnosis process because the waiting list is just ridiculous. So I sat down with my psychiatrist, and he was actually really renowned. So he was a leader in the field. He was a professor for Cambridge University. So when I went for my ADHD diagnosis, he said I passed with flying colours. He said, I can't believe you haven't been diagnosed with this sooner. And at this point, he actually said, I think you might have autism as well. So we discussed this, and he said that one of the reasons why he thinks that I, like so many others with these two disorders, had slipped under the net is, on the one side, you've got ADHD, which is really spontaneous, impulsive, quite makes you quite sociable. You're always wanting to do things, and you can't just live a normal mundane life. On the other hand, you've got autism, which it makes you very quite insociable. You just want routine and everything to be structured. And the two are such polar opposites that actually they cancel each other out a bit on the surface. Internally, they absolutely do not. But I remember when I got diagnosed, I realised that actually this is why I've been self-medicating. This is why I've especially been struggling to stay sober as a mother, because everything in life is just overwhelming, and all of a sudden my crutch was taken away, but being a mother was put into the game, and that in itself is difficult for anyone. But I don't think it's spoken enough about how difficult it is to be a neurodivergent mother. Yeah. So after I was diagnosed with ADHD, I got medicated. But what we started to realise, me and my healthcare professionals, was that actually the addiction had gone, the ADHD was being managed, but I was feeling really low, and I was diagnosed with postnatal depression. So I was then medicated with sertraline for the postnatal depression, and then my ADHD meds, which was Elvance Adult. And I started to recover really fast, which at first everyone thought was great. But then it started to escalate. And what we soon realised was that actually not only did I have ADHD and autism, but also I had bipolar. And the medications for the ADHD and for the anxiety from the postnatal depression actually triggered a manic episode. And this was horrendous, really horrendous. If my coming off addiction was my worst time in my life, this was my second worst time, because I ended up being sectioned, which meant I was removed from my son, who was only 1 year old at the time. I ended up having to go to a mental hospital in Nottingham. I was then transferred back to Newcastle, and it was just the most terrifying thing possible. And on top of that, the worst thing was I knew about attachment style, and I knew how that had impacted me and sent me down this road where I ended up self-medicating with alcohol and drugs in my 20s. But then I started having this fear that actually I've now impacted my child's attachment style because his mum was removed. So it was just a really dark and scary time. Yeah. So my biggest advice to anyone is, if you are a parent or anyone who's struggling with addiction, is first see the addiction as a symptom. It's not the addiction that's the problem. That is an invite to you to look at why am I self-medicating? And as an addictions counsellor and somebody who's been through it, what I can tell you is that more often than not, it is some kind of childhood trauma or some trauma which has happened in your life, or it's undiagnosed mental health disorders. And in my case, in quite a lot of people's cases, it's both. So I would invite you to look at, why am I experiencing addiction, and use that as an opportunity to look at what's going on, because there is no way you can heal the addiction if you're not healing the root cause. The second thing that I will say is the biggest barrier in addiction that you can face is the shame. We really need to start looking at ourselves and thinking, this is not my fault. This is a symptom, and how can I pour love into myself? And I would also like to say to anybody who knows somebody who has an addiction, again, try and have that mentality. Don't shame that person for having the addiction, because that was such a barrier for me, especially as a mother and as somebody who shamed myself. Try and think about this person is struggling internally and how can I support them through showing them love and compassion and trying to get them the right support that they need. Yeah. Thank you so much for listening to my start again. My name's Ashley, and thank you for listening to my story. If you would like some support with mental health, you can check out my podcast, which is The Tarot Therapist. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, look, it's I think your story is really going to inspire people because you've obviously been through a lot, and I think it's really, as you know, I'm about to do a neurodivergence documentary, and obviously you're a professional in therapy, and I think we should talk about the most inspiring part of your journey. And it's not just the fact you're here today telling your story to help other people, because it's brave of you, it's inspiring. So many people are going to be so grateful watching this, and it does help people out there to tell their stories. It's not easy to do. So yeah, if I had a hat, I'll take it off to you. Yeah. No worries. So let's talk about your podcast. Let's talk about what you have built now, yes. Because it's absolutely amazing. You should be so proud of yourself. I know you are as well. Yeah. Let's go.
So for me, what happened was when I got sectioned, they told us I wasn't allowed to work. It was unethical. So having the itchy feet that I do, I thought actually I can't be a therapist for other people, but maybe I can start a podcast. So I started doing a podcast where basically I just tapped into all the knowledge I've learned over the last 16 years of studying and then practicing to be a counsellor. It's just a zero cost access to everything I know. So it's not a replacement for therapy, but it's just giving people the tools that are just so difficult to access. Yeah, because of waiting times and cost.
Yeah, amazing. That's amazing. I think it's amazing what you do, and I look at the camera and say this. Please go and check out Ashley's page. I'll tag it in this video, and I'll put it at the end of this short story on your difficult but also inspiring journey.
Thank you. And so what he said, check it out.
Well, I said, check it out. Yeah. I think we should now make some videos all about your work, because I think it's really interesting, and if you to put some out there.
Let's do this.
Thank you so much as well. I'll shake your hand again. Keep it formal.
Yeah.
No, it's no formal here. It's been casual, isn't it? We had a nice day.
Also a little bit sweaty as well.
Yeah, I'm definitely a bit sweaty. Yeah.
Takes away the formality of it.
Yeah, it does. No, it does.